In November 1923, Frau Eisenmenger walked into a Berlin bakery carrying a wheelbarrow full of German marks. She needed the wheelbarrow not to carry home her bread, but to carry the money required to buy a single loaf. By the time she reached the front of the line, the price had doubled. That afternoon, she returned with a larger wheelbarrow and more money. The bread cost 10 times more than it had that morning. By evening, the bakery was closed. The baker couldn't afford to bake bread because the cost of flour increased faster than he could collect payment from customers. Within 1 year, the German mark went from 4.2 marks per dollar to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. A currency that had anchored European trade for generations became worthless paper that people burned for heat because it was cheaper than firewood. The Weimar Republic's hyperinflation didn't happen by accident. It followed a precise sequence that every failing government has repeated throughout history when faced with unpayable debts and unlimited printing presses. Today, America is following that exact same playbook, step by step, decision by decision, rationalization by rationalization. And just like Weimar Germany, American authorities believe they're different. They believe their currency is special. They believe their economy is too large to collapse. They believe their technology makes historical patterns obsolete. The pattern says otherwise. Walk through any American grocery store, and you can feel the early stages of the same process that destroyed Germany nearly a century ago. Prices that once seemed stable now change weekly. Packages that once contained consistent quantities now shrink while prices rise. Workers who once felt financially secure now struggle to afford basics, despite earning more nominal income than ever before. The mathematics are identical. The government spends more money than it collects. The difference gets printed into existence. The newly created money competes with existing money for the same goods. Prices rise to reflect the increased money supply. The government responds by printing more money to maintain spending levels. It's a feedback loop that accelerates until it destroys the currency entirely. Stage 1. The debt trap. Every hyperinflation begins with a government that owes more money than it can possibly repay through normal taxation. The Weimar Republic inherited massive war debts from World War I, plus reparation payments to allied nations that exceeded Germany's ability to pay. American debt has reached $36 trillion, while annual tax collections barely exceed $4 trillion. Interest payments alone consume nearly $1 trillion annually, leaving insufficient revenue to fund government operations without additional borrowing. Like Weimar Germany, America faces obligations that exceed economic capacity to service them. Social Security, Medicare, military commitments, and infrastructure needs demand spending that far surpasses any realistic tax collection scenario. The Weimar government convinced itself that economic growth would eventually solve the debt problem. American politicians make the same argument today, claiming that GDP expansion will make current debt levels manageable, while proposing additional spending programs that require even more borrowing. But debt grows exponentially, while economies grow linearly. When debt service consumes increasing percentages of government revenue, the mathematics become impossible, regardless of economic growth rates. Weimar officials knew their debt was unsustainable, but believed they had no choice except to continue borrowing and hope for eventual relief through economic expansion or political negotiation. American officials acknowledge fiscal unsustainability, but maintain the same hope that future growth or policy changes will somehow resolve mathematical impossibilities. The debt trap closes when markets lose confidence in the government's ability to repay, forcing higher interest rates that accelerate the insolvency they were meant to prevent. Stage 2. Monetary financing. When conventional borrowing becomes too expensive, governments turn to their central banks for financing. The Reichsbank began purchasing German government bonds with newly created marks, providing immediate funding while disguising the transaction as monetary policy rather than debt monetization. The Federal Reserve has purchased over $8 trillion in government securities since 2008, creating dollars from nothing to fund deficit spending, while claiming the operations support economic stability rather than government financing. Central bank financing feels like magic because it provides unlimited government funding without immediate consequences. Politicians can spend without raising taxes. Citizens receive benefits without visible costs. Economic activity appears to increase, while living standards seem to improve. But central bank financing violates the fundamental principle that money must represent real economic value to maintain purchasing power. When central banks create money to finance government spending rather than to facilitate productive economic activity, the new money competes with existing money for goods and services. Prices rise to reflect the increased money supply. Workers demand higher wages to maintain living standards. Businesses raise prices to cover increased costs. The government needs more money to fund the same programs at higher prices. The cycle accelerates as central bank financing becomes normalized and expected. Every economic slowdown triggers demands for more monetary stimulus. Every price increase justifies additional money creation to maintain affordability. Weimar officials convinced themselves that monetary financing was temporary emergency policy that would end once economic conditions improved. American officials make identical arguments about quantitative easing and emergency lending programs that have become permanent features of fiscal policy. Stage 3. Psychological transformation. The critical phase occurs when populations lose faith in money as a store of value and begin treating currency as a short-term transaction medium rather than a long-term savings vehicle. In Weimar, Germany, citizens learned to spend money immediately upon receiving it because prices rose faster than savings could accumulate. Shopping patterns shifted from monthly planning to daily necessities. Workers demanded daily wage payments instead of weekly or monthly paychecks. American consumption patterns are beginning to show identical characteristics. Credit card usage has exploded as people prefer debt to cash savings that lose purchasing power through inflation. Real estate prices have skyrocketed as investors flee currency for hard assets. Stock markets have reached unprecedented valuations as people seek any alternative to holding dollars. The psychological shift accelerates when people realize that earning, saving, and investing, according to traditional principles, actually makes them poorer in real terms, while spending and borrowing provide protection against currency debasement. Citizens develop sophisticated strategies for minimizing currency exposure. They purchase goods before needed to avoid future price increases. They borrow in depreciating currency to acquire appreciating assets. They delay income while accelerating expenses to optimize timing around inflation. These rational individual responses to currency debasement create collective behavior that accelerates the very inflation people are trying to escape. When everyone tries to hold minimal currency, velocity increases dramatically. When velocity increases, inflation accelerates. The government response worsens the problem by attempting to control symptoms rather than addressing causes. Price controls create shortages that force black market premiums. Wage controls create labor shortages that force under-the-table payments. Banking regulations create capital flight that forces underground financial systems. Each intervention designed to slow inflation actually accelerates it by reducing economic efficiency while increasing the money creation needed to finance enforcement and compliance systems. Stage 4. Mathematical acceleration. Hyperinflation reaches escape velocity when the time required to double prices drops below the time required to implement policy responses. At this point, government actions cannot keep pace with currency debasement, regardless of political will or economic expertise. Weimar Germany reached this threshold when prices began doubling daily. Policymakers who needed weeks to design and implement responses faced conditions that changed completely every 24 hours. By the time any policy took effect, the economic situation it was meant to address had evolved beyond recognition. American inflation has not reached daily doubling rates, but the acceleration pattern is identical. Monthly price changes that once required years now occur in months. Economic conditions that historically evolved gradually now shift rapidly. Policy responses that once had predictable effects now produce unexpected consequences. The Federal Reserve faces the same timing problem that destroyed the Reichsbank. Interest rate changes require months to affect economic activity, but financial conditions change daily based on currency expectations and international capital flows. When policy-making cycles become slower than market reaction cycles, authorities lose control, regardless of their theoretical tools or legal authority. Markets move faster than governments can respond. The mathematical acceleration phase begins when people understand that holding currency guarantees losses, while almost any alternative provides protection. At this point, the government must choose between allowing complete currency collapse or implementing authoritarian controls that destroy the economic freedom necessary for recovery. Weimar chose authoritarian controls that made the economic collapse worse, while destroying the political institutions needed for eventual stabilization. Stage 5. Social breakdown. Hyperinflation destroys more than currency. It destroys the social contracts that hold civilization together. When money becomes worthless, economic relationships become impossible, and society reverts to primitive survival behaviors. In Weimar Germany, middle-class families who had saved for generations found their life's work worthless overnight. Professional workers discovered that daily wages couldn't buy daily necessities. Elderly people who had lived on fixed pensions faced starvation as their income became meaningless. The social fabric unraveled as traditional economic relationships became impossible to maintain. Employers couldn't pay workers wages that retained value between morning and evening. Landlords couldn't collect rents that covered property taxes that doubled monthly. Merchants couldn't price goods that maintained profit margins when input costs changed hourly. Barter replaced currency for many transactions, but barter requires coincidence of wants that rarely exists in complex economies. A baker might need shoes, but the shoemaker might need medical care rather than bread. Complex supply chains collapsed when participants couldn't establish fair exchange ratios for constantly depreciating currency. Crime exploded as legal economic activity became impossible for many citizens. When working honestly couldn't provide survival necessities, survival required alternative methods. Social institutions lost legitimacy when they couldn't protect citizens from economic devastation caused by government policies. Political extremism flourished as moderate approaches proved incapable of addressing mathematical impossibilities. Citizens who had supported democratic institutions lost faith when those institutions couldn't solve problems they had created through their own policy failures. The social breakdown phase becomes irreversible when more citizens survive through informal or illegal economic activity than through official employment and legal commerce. At this point, government authority depends on force rather than consent, while economic activity depends on personal relationships rather than institutional structures. The American trajectory. America hasn't reached Weimar's final stages, but the progression through early phases follows identical patterns with disturbing precision. Federal deficit spending has become permanent, regardless of economic conditions or political control. Both parties promise fiscal responsibility while proposing policies that require additional borrowing. Neither conservative nor liberal economic approaches acknowledge the mathematical impossibility of current debt trajectories. Federal Reserve policy has evolved from emergency intervention to permanent economic management through continuous market manipulation. Interest rates, bond purchases, and lending programs that were supposed to be temporary have become permanent features of financial markets that cannot function without constant central bank support. American savings behavior has shifted from traditional accumulation toward immediate consumption and asset speculation. Young people can't afford homes through saving and instead compete for mortgages that require debt service exceeding historical income ratios. Retirement planning has shifted from conservative accumulation toward aggressive speculation in overvalued markets. Social trust in institutions has declined, as those institutions prove incapable of addressing obvious problems through conventional approaches. Political polarization has increased, as moderate solutions prove inadequate for mathematical challenges that require dramatic policy changes neither side will accept. The pattern suggests that America has completed stages 1 through 3 and is entering stage 4, mathematical acceleration beyond policy control. The triggering event. Weimar's hyperinflation accelerated into collapse when foreign exchange markets lost confidence in the German government's ability to service its debts in hard currency. International investors demanded payment in gold or stable foreign currencies rather than marks, forcing the Reichsbank to print marks to buy foreign currency to service obligation. America faces identical dynamics as foreign central banks reduce treasury holdings while domestic obligations continue expanding. When foreign investors demand payment in alternative currencies or hard assets rather than dollars, the Federal Reserve will face the same impossible choice: print dollars to purchase foreign currencies or default on obligations. The triggering event could involve Taiwan, where American military commitments might require war spending that exceeds fiscal capacity. It could involve the banking system, where rising interest rates create insolvencies that require bailouts exceeding political acceptability. It could involve Social Security, where demographic realities force benefit cuts that trigger political crisis. But the specific trigger matters less than the underlying mathematics. When debt service exceeds government revenue and money printing accelerates to bridge the gap, the hyperinflation sequence becomes inevitable, regardless of political intentions or economic expertise. The modern context. Technology accelerates every phase of currency collapse while making traditional escape routes more difficult. Digital payments systems enable instantaneous velocity increases that amplify inflation faster than historical patterns. Global financial markets allow immediate capital flight that overwhelms domestic policy responses. Social media spreads currency confidence crises faster than authorities can respond with reassuring messaging. Cryptocurrency provides alternatives to government currency that didn't exist during previous hyperinflations, but that limit government control over monetary systems. Modern welfare states create political pressures that make fiscal responsibility impossible, even when leaders understand the mathematical requirements for currency stability. Democratic systems cannot impose the short-term hardships necessary to prevent long-term currency collapse, when voters can replace leaders who propose painful but necessary solutions. The global scale of dollar usage means that American hyperinflation would affect every economy simultaneously, making recovery more difficult and international cooperation less likely. When the world's reserve currency collapses, there are no stable external alternatives available for anchor or comparison. The historical inevitability. Every government in history that has faced Weimar's fiscal mathematics has followed Weimar's policy sequence and achieved Weimar's results. No amount of technological sophistication or economic expertise has enabled exceptions to the mathematical rules governing currency debasement. Argentina experienced hyperinflation in 1989. Venezuela experienced hyperinflation in 2018. Zimbabwe experienced hyperinflation in 2008. Each episode followed the identical sequence: unsustainable debt, central bank financing, psychological transformation, mathematical acceleration, and social breakdown. The specific details vary by country and historical period, but the fundamental pattern remains constant, because human nature and mathematical principles remain constant across cultures and centuries. American exceptionalism cannot exempt America from mathematical reality any more than German industrial superiority exempted Germany from currency mathematics in 1923. The Weimar playbook is being executed in real time. The stages are proceeding on schedule. The outcome has been predetermined by fiscal and monetary choices that cannot be reversed without political consequences that no democratic system can accept. Understanding the pattern doesn't prevent the outcome. It only explains why the outcome becomes inevitable once the initial choices lock in the sequence of subsequent decisions. History says America is next because America is following the exact same playbook that has never produced different results. The only question is timing. And based on current debt trajectories and monetary policies, the timing is accelerating toward the same mathematical breaking point that destroyed every previous currency that attempted to finance unlimited government spending through unlimited money creation. The wheelbarrows are already being manufactured. The only question is when Americans will need them.